Welcome to Core Volunteer Training tonight. Our lesson is on understanding Congress and how a bill becomes law. And as I've said before, we're very lucky tonight to have our very own Ben Pendergrass with us. Ben is CCL's Senior Director for Government Affairs and is a part of the CCL Government Relations team in Washington, D.C. In this role, he works to advance the policy of CCL throughout Congress. Ben's got significant legislative experience under his belt, over 14 years in Washington, both as congressional staff and as a government relations professional. For several years, Ben served on the legislative staff of Senator Pete Domenici, Republican, New Mexico. Most recently, he was Senior Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs for a National Trade Association and has worked in a wide range of policy areas, including taxes, natural resources, agriculture, and national security. Ben grew up in New Mexico and has a degree from Tulane and now lives in Arlington. We are honored to have you on the line tonight, and we're going to pass it to you in just a quick review after of the learning goals. What we're focusing on tonight's lesson with are the following hopeful goals for all attendees. First, to gain a deeper sense of what the typical day looks like in a life of a congressional staffer. Secondly, to understand the makeup of Congress and how to best engage congressional staff throughout that body in the legislative process. We really want to make sure to highlight some of the overlooked challenges that often present themselves for our elected officials and their staff, as well as opportunities that spin off from that. And then lastly, we also are going to highlight how to prepare to use CCL's tools to be more engaged with your member of Congress and also share these tools with your friends, families, and social connections moving ahead. The agenda is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to talk most about membership and then jump into terminology, committees, both chambers' role and responsibility, congressional offices makeup. We'll actually have a fun webinar, little 3-minute video from the Congressional Management Foundation, and then have a deeper Q&A with a former DC staffer. Ben can tell you about the challenge that the shutdown presented with that in a little bit, and then we'll have partner actions at the end as mentioned.
Well, good evening. I'm glad I could join everybody tonight and happy to be here. I'm sure everybody's been watching the news and was wondering how the government shutdown affects everything. Well, luckily, since it was only 3 days, it really didn't affect a whole lot. But as we go forward and there are future threats of shutdowns, the biggest thing from the CCL perspective you should know is when this happens, if you have developed a relationship with your member of Congress and staff, it might become very difficult to communicate with them in those shutdowns. Some offices keep employees at the office, but a lot follow the protocols and only keep essential staff, and they really won't be available for normal business, so to speak. But since we only had it happen for 3 days, that's all we really need to talk about right now on that. So we're going to do a very basic overview of how the House and Senate work tonight. Pretty high level. Obviously, in the Senate, there's 2 senators per state, 100 senators total. They serve 6-year terms. On the House side, there's 1 representative per district. It's based on population, usually around 800,000 per district. There's 435 total members of the House, and they only serve for 2-year terms. So right off the bat, there's a lot more of them, and they are basically constantly in election mode. Now, Congress works through a committee system. This is where a lot of the work is done on most bills. Committees can either originate legislation, or if a bill is introduced by a member not on a committee, it will be referred to a committee. There are several different types of committees, but the only one that we really need to deal with are standing committees. These are what you generally think about being a congressional committee with oversight over something like agriculture, appropriations, armed services. There are also select committees that come together for a special purpose, like an investigation, for instance, and joint committees that are more administrative. Each house has its own committees for particular jurisdictions. The House, for instance, for taxes has Ways and Means. The Senate has the Finance Committee. So any tax-related bill would go through one of these committees on the House or the Senate. One important thing to remember is on the House side, a bill might be referred to more than one committee. They have what's called sequential review. So a bill might go to the House Agriculture Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, and the Natural Resources Committee, depending on what provisions are in that bill. Our particular proposal, because it does hit on a couple different things, would probably get referred to multiple committees in the House. Whereas on the Senate side, a bill can only go to one committee. And so if like our carbon fee proposal would just go to the Senate Finance Committee. That would be the only committee it would go to in all likelihood. The committees work generally through a hearing and markup process. First, a committee will have a hearing on a bill or an issue where they take testimony. They invite experts and other witnesses to come and talk about the pros and cons of a bill, what they think a bill should do, whether or not they oppose a bill, and then they move to what's called a markup phase. This is where they actually start working on the legislation. There's usually several opportunities to amend the bills, the first being in a subcommittee markup, and then a full committee markup. And after a committee has marked up a piece of legislation, it then moves on to the full chamber. Now, the Senate and House of Representatives are both pretty unique creatures. They have their own cultures. In the Senate, committees can be more easily bypassed. On the House of Representatives, almost everything does go through the markup process. The Senate is known as the world's greatest deliberative body and allows for unlimited debate. The House, with 435 members, has specific rules on how to debate and how amendments can be offered. For instance, on the House side, before any bill comes to the floor, the Rules Committee meets to develop a rule for that bill that dictates the terms of debate, decides which amendments can be considered, and which are non-germane. So that's an entirely different process from the Senate, where basically any member can introduce an amendment. You can see where with only 100 members, it's a lot easier for them to do things on the floor. In the Senate, in particular, members are often involved in a lot of different issues. Members usually serve on anywhere from 4 to 5 committees. In the House, because there are so many members, members usually only serve on 1 to 2 committees. And that's where they usually place most of their focus. They might still co-sponsor bills, try to get involved, but that committee they're on is where they have the most opportunity to actually do their work. The Senate is usually focused more on foreign policy, and it also has the unique role of providing for the confirmation process for executive officials. They have to deal with Supreme Court nominations, federal court nominations, any cabinet members, and all the hundreds of confirmable positions. They have to take the responsibility for that, whereas the House has no role in the confirmation process. All tax and revenue bills must originate in the House by law. And so even though they might have a parallel track, it still has to come out of the House of Representatives at some point. Floor action in the Senate is pretty important. Things operate on a much more personal basis with relationships with senators often introducing multiple amendments to bills and using relationships to get those amendments considered on the floor. Whereas in the House, most opportunity to amend a bill is going to take place in the committee, not on the floor. And the ability to introduce amendments on the floor is usually very limited. Now there's several different state or local offices that most members have. On the Senate side, you'd usually have multiple district offices spread around the state. On the House, because they have a smaller, usually the district is much smaller than a state, they might only have 1 or 2 offices unless they have a very large state that they feel like they need to cover. Something like Wyoming, where you only have 1 rep for the whole state. He basically has to operate as a senator with less staff. The main component of the staffs, though, are located here in Washington, D.C. This is where all the press people are located, the legislative and policy-making people, and the chiefs of staff and senators and members of Congress are all located here in DC for the most part. They run these offices as personal fiefdoms. Members get to choose a wide way of running their offices. They can choose their staff composition. The offices are responsible for designing their own websites, how they respond to correspondence, and how offices can be made up varies greatly state to state, district to district, with House offices having a set budget and a set number of maximum staff. Senate offices, it's based on population, because obviously a state like California needs a much larger budget than a small state like Vermont when you're talking about a statewide office holder. Some of the staff members you'll come into contact with on most regular basis are schedulers, staff assistants, legislative correspondents, legislative assistants, and legislative directors, and the chief of staff. Schedulers are primarily responsible for setting meetings for the member and setting his personal schedule. Now, some offices, the scheduler will also arrange meetings for other staff, or if you reach out to the scheduler, she will refer to you to a particular staff member. She or he is basically the gatekeeper for the office. Staff assistants are the most junior staff that are usually responsible for answering phones. They'll be the first people you come in to the office that you see. They take people on tours. Next, you have legislative correspondence, and these actually vary greatly by the House and Senate. On the House side, each office usually only has one legislative correspondent whose primary focus is responding to constituent mail. You probably won't come into contact with them too much on the House unless they're filling in for somebody that couldn't make a meeting. On the Senate side, there are usually multiple legislative correspondents, 4 to 6. They act as junior LAs and often are assigned policy areas. They are still responsible for responding to congressional correspondence, but they also write floor speeches, write other speeches for the members, and act, like I said, as junior LAs with responsibilities for the policy areas. And if you do meet with a legislative correspondent, they will have some role in developing policy in conjunction with the LA, and will often bring ideas to the member or senior staff. The most common staff you will run into are legislative assistants. These are the primary policy experts on staff. Each legislative assistant has a portfolio of issues that they deal with, and sometimes they're shifting. For instance, I dealt with Veterans Affairs, Labor, Homeland Security, and defense issues at one time. At another time, I dealt with Foreign Affairs, Agriculture, Social Security. So it can change. So the staff member you might be meeting with really might either be very up to speed on the issues, or they might have just been transferred into a new set of issues that they have a lot to catch up on. But these are the staff members that are dealing, tracking legislation, bringing proposals to the member, and these will be the people you meet with the most. Legislative directors are responsible for setting the member's legislative agenda, getting bills he wants passed, and supervising the entire legislative staff. On the House side, legislative directors are also more like senior LAs in a way, where they will often handle issues themselves or be assigned issues. And you will often, a lot of times, meet with legislative directors on the House side. On the Senate side, you're less likely going to meet with legislative directors, and they usually do not take on specific issues unless it is a particular priority for that member of the Senate. And the chief of staff is responsible for overseeing the entire staff, where you have the political component, the communications component, the administrative component. He is the captain of the ship, so to speak, and is usually plays a very important role in determining the member's agenda. One thing to bear in mind too is the number of staff varies greatly. Like I said, the House is limited, so you're only going to have like one LC, one staff assistant, maybe 2 LAs, an LD, and a chief of staff. Senate with the bigger offices, you might have 4 to 6 LCs, 4 to 6 LAs, or if the member works on a particular issue, there's also something called a congressional fellow. And you might actually meet with these fellows depending on the office. If you are on the Armed Services Committee, you will likely have a fellow from the military. If you work on energy or natural resources issues, you might have somebody from the Forest Service detailed to the office or somebody from one of the nuclear laboratories. These are kind of policy experts that join the staff for limited periods of time that come from other parts of the government. And those are the primary staff you'll work with. The staff has a pretty big workload. And I think this is something for CCL volunteers to be very aware of, even though we know how important the issue is to us and we feel the need to take action immediately. Staffers are dealing with a lot of issues. If you have a meeting with them that day, they probably have 5, 6, 7, 8 other meetings, and they're trying to divide their time equally. They're also trying to analyze and draft legislation sometimes, and it makes for very long work hours with oftentimes very little pay. Now, the House offices in particular are pretty cramped. You usually have a center hall with the staff assistants and maybe 2 tiny offices for somebody, the member's office, and then just a general area where everybody has a computer and a desk. Nobody has their own office, very cramped. On the Senate side, we do get a lot more office space. We usually have multiple conference rooms. Chief of staffs, LDs have their own offices, and everybody has some more space. And this is a big thing because when you go to the House, a lot of times you would either just meet in the member's office, because that's really the only meeting space they have a lot of times, or you might even have to meet in the hall. And don't get offended if you have to meet in the hall. It's just a matter of space, not something against you. On the Senate side, though, you're more likely to actually meet in a conference room. One thing to really be aware of is the amount of correspondence has increased exponentially. 15 years ago, most of the mail was still actual mail that got sorted and processed and responded to. Now it's mostly emails. Because of the ease of email communication, it has just skyrocketed. And as the statistic says, between a 200 and 1,000% increase in constituent mail. That makes it really easy for mail to get lost. The other big change I don't think people realized is it has become ubiquitous for people to directly contact a staff member. Once upon a time, the scheduler really did act as a gatekeeper, and it would have been very rare unless you already had a relationship to be able to reach out directly to a staff member. Now those emails are widely available, and so a staff member might be getting 50, 100, 150 emails from other lobbyists, other constituents, other offices a day, if not even more. So if they don't get back to you immediately, don't be offended. They just have a lot of email to go through. DC staff is usually pretty young, is the last thing I wanted to touch on. Don't be offended when they are in their 20s. They're usually very bright individuals. They're working very hard, but the tenure is not long, and you won't often come across too many staff that are above the age of 30.
Well, we'll do this here, and I think all of us are giving you a huge enthusiastic round of applause, Ben, for just really all of your expertise, time, and wisdom tonight. Ben's actually going to help me out for the introduction on the first part of these kind of activities that we're going to go through. So this is all available online again, and we just wanted to highlight a couple of the resources, especially newer volunteers might not be aware is available for you and for your network. So these are not only kind of targeted for new volunteers, but for a resource that you can send friends, family, put it on Facebook, email people, whatever you want to do. It's trying to make this process very easy and intuitive. This first one is all about writing an email in Congress. You can see that we have in the Take Action Center on Community, if you go to Take Action and then right under here, under Write or Email Congress, this great page that you can interact with. This is another wonderful learning center. resource. You can see, it talks first about the importance of personal communication, about really how emails make a difference. And then also kind of even asking, is writing or emailing more important? You can click on a lesson about it. You can click on planning, do it, example letters, you name it. Little tips here are really important just to highlight even tonight. Only one issue at a time. Write separate letters for more than one issue. Be short and concise, direct. Remember, staffers have limited time. Be sure to have legible handwriting. That's less and less of a problem these days, but something still to keep in mind. And include your own return address so they know your constituent, along with being CCL, polite, factual, and appreciative. Now, we also have a Call Congress resource right below that. If you were to click on Call Congress, and you can see, again, the same format of Plan It, Do It, Call-In days. We actually have 2 days every year where we try to flex our organizational muscle and generate the most calls to be noticed throughout the country. And at this point, you can also find advice on how to build an appreciation, how to share your own story, and even follow your own script. Now, all of these are available in our resource that we're going to talk about in just a little bit, but I know I wanted to highlight kind of Ben's wisdom on one final summary slide before we jump into that kind of next step.
And these are just a couple tips. I really am a big believer in personalizing your communications. Tell them what's important to you, what's happening locally in your state or district that you're seeing, why it's important to you. If you have experience, if you've spent years working in the oil and gas industry or in the renewable energy sector, like share that information with staff, make it stand out. I think it's important to stay away from form letters. It's so easy now to just click a button and send a form letter, and they get 500 of the same letter, and the staff knows it's a form letter and knows you didn't have to put much effort in to write that letter, and they tend to view it more as a petition and devalue that a little bit. They can still be useful if you are just trying to generate numbers to show a member that you don't want them to do a specific action. Like if there's a bill that's coming up in a day and you just want them to vote no, sometimes you got to use a form letter and just make sure they get a lot of letters. In all your communication with staff members' time, like I said, try to be respectful of their time. You're not the only one talking to them. You're not the only one emailing them. They have a lot of other issues going on, and it's just good to be aware of that yours isn't the only issue they're dealing with. It's always really good to be aware of what issues staff members are dealing with at the time. Recently, a volunteer had a good start to relationship with a staff member and a member of Congress, but it just so happened that this member of Congress was on the Ways and Means Committee, and the staff member was his primary tax aide, and so the communication kind of went silent when they were doing the big tax bill. So that's going to be pretty obvious that if they're working on the tax bill and that's their primary focus right then, they might not have a lot of time for other stuff. It's the same thing with the government shutdown. You're probably not going to get a response from staff during that. Or if the staff member you're works on defense issues and they're marking up the defense authorization bill, they're going to be busy and they might not have time for other issues. Tailor your communication to your goal. Like I said, if you're trying to create a long-term relationship, have a personalized email. Start having those phone conversations where the staff learns about you and learns what CCL is doing, how we can help them. Staff always likes it like when things are framed like, what can we do for you, rather than like, we want you to do this for us. But at the same time, when issues come up, sometimes they come up very quickly. And you just need to you might need to make a whole bunch of phone calls to the offices and get a whole bunch of other people to make phone calls to get the members' attention on a specific vote, a specific amendment that's coming up, where you might not have much time. So to take that into consideration for what type of communication you're using. Obviously, CCL is different in that we have congressional liaisons assigned to most members of Congress. This is pretty important because CCL is big and getting bigger. And if every CCL volunteer in a district or state was constantly contacting one staff member, might be really hard for him to keep track of that. So we work through the liaison that has the primary role of responding, communicating on a daily basis, weekly basis with that staff member. And that's really important to respect that. It's important to cultivate relationships with both DC staff and district staff, but be aware of their limitations. DC staff probably won't be in the district much, and district staff really has no role in the policy-making apparatus. All that's done in DC. So district staff, while you can build that relationship with them, they can help you schedule things like town halls and maybe get the member out to do a site visit. They're not going to have a lot of power to convince the member to sponsor legislation, change legislation, or determine how they vote. And just be aware of those different roles. District staff is just there to be a face and a conduit of communication in the state and don't have much power beyond that.
Excellent. This came up as you were sharing this excellent summary slide here. Ben, Bob asks, are cards better than letters with security screening concerns?
Well, letters have really, CCL actually hand delivers members letters and cards because it's quicker. It's a great way to like communicate, because right now the security screening process adds a month to 2 months to any letter making it to a member. They have to go to a special processing facility because of some of the scares we've had in the past with ricin and other things, and get irradiated, opened, checked out before they make it to the member's office. So it's a really slow way to communicate with your member, as opposed to something like if a card, I'm not sure what the security process is for that now, but I know when we hand deliver them, those are easy because you cannot take a sealed envelope into a DC office. Security will check you. If you hand the staff member a sealed envelope, they will not want to take it. So that's one reason like cards could be pretty handy.
And as Bob's saying, the program that we run is called the Envoy program, and we've put that in the chat window here again. It's basically under the Take Action Center. If you just look for delivering letters to Congress, the specific Envoy program is an actual group. But you're welcome to also kind of, be able to learn more about it. I'll put a profile of the actual kind of Envoy program in the blog that we had featured right here too. Good to know, Janet, that they actually irradiate postcards as well as letters. I guess at this point we can't be too safe with security concerns. So let's use the last 10 minutes of our call to really jump into action here. And a quick description. Again, thank you, Ben, so much for your time and perspective of what we're trying to accomplish with partner actions every week. So, social science research highlights that essentially 3 factors really all converging together help us all as, social animals create an effective goal planning mechanism. And those are having specific short-term or stretch goals. They're having that support system built up around you to encourage you and to celebrate when those accomplishments happen. And so as an actual CCL network for core volunteer training every week, we provide that for each other through this partner action plan. And the easiest way to do that is just logging on to bit.ly. It's a little short URL, and then type in /CCL partners, CCL and capital P for partners. I'm putting the link right there. And every week we personalize this with the action plan of what we're working on within core volunteer training. Tonight, what we're going to do is essentially have people pair up, share their background like we do, share any big takeaways or remaining questions you have, and then get to work with some of those resources that we've put in the chat window to find out who your chapter's liaison is. You can do that especially through your group leader contact, as well as then personally planning how you'd like to communicate with your member of Congress. I'll just close real quick by highlighting that, again, if you have questions, Ben's contact information is here. It's Ben at Citizens Climate. Mine is Brett at Citizens Climate. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.